Quantum-inspired approaches are powering real use cases while we wait for more powerful quantum computers. Find out how one company is using them to bring under-display cameras and other technologies to market today in this episode of the Post-Quantum World. I'm your host, Konstantinos Karagiannis. I lead quantum computing services at Protiviti, where we're helping companies prepare for the benefits and threats of this exploding field. I hope you'll join each episode as we explore the technology and business impacts of this post-quantum era. Our guest today is the VP of Materials Discovery at OTI Lumionics, Scott Genin. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So this is going to be a slightly different episode because it looks like we've got some quantum that actually led to some real world product ideas and things. So yeah, I know your company actually built something, so there's going to be some cool avenues to explore here today. But first, I'd love to hear about how you ended up in your role and what aspects of your journey led to you being involved in quantum too, particularly.
So I can just briefly start. Prior to joining OTI Lumionics, I was working in the biotech space, biopharma, where I was effectively doing kind of experimental design, statistical processing, and in some cases also automation, like setting up machines to basically do automated processes. So in our case, media formulation and growth conditions for various stem cell and other stem cell based kind of derivatives. But a lot of it was how do you automate machines to, basically set up, hundreds and thousands of experiments in one shot. And then how do you do the statistical and, we never really called it machine learning back then. It was pretty much just the NIST handbook, using the NIST handbook and using those guides to determine what are optimal conditions. I'm sure in some cases that flies as AI and machine learning now. I still don't consider that. But in kind of after doing that for a while, kind of was, realizing that it was like, oh, well, you don't actually need that much mathematics and statistics. So it was, I started kind of looking around to see whether there are other better fits for me. And, I got reconnected to Michael Helander, who I had actually met during my PhD. I had just started my PhD at University of Toronto, and he was finishing up his postdoc. And so we got reconnected, and he said, well, why don't you come and join OTI, to do some, types of process controls. I ho-hummed about it. And then eventually, I decided to join. And at the start, it was just, do standard quantum chemistry simulations, standard molecular dynamics simulations, and design of experiments to make new chemicals. We were very successful at that, using those initial methods. But then the opportunity came up through the Creative Destruction Lab to actually start working with a quantum computer. And so, Michael Helander came into the office one day when there was just 16 of us. And he said, well, would a quantum computer help you do quantum chemistry better? And I was like, well, I don't know. Let's go find out. And so really that's the starting point of where, we, our journey. And, it's actually been now almost a 6-year journey. Doing quantum chemistry for quantum computers, and whether we can actually extract any sort of value from that, whether we can mimic a quantum computer just for doing quantum chemistry. But really it was, that kind of moment, and kind of thanks to the Creative Destruction Lab for kind of coordinating, getting some preliminary quantum resources.
Yeah. And the answer is always, can a quantum computer help? Well, it depends on what quantum computer you're talking about and where we are in the timeline right now, right? So I think we should zoom out and then zoom back into the little pieces. So overall, how would you describe OTI Lumionics to listeners?
OTI Lumionics, first and foremost, is a materials company. We have large amounts of staff and resources dedicated to testing, developing new materials, maintaining pilot production lines and advanced laboratory equipment. We predominantly focus in the display and semiconductors industries. Our chemicals are shipped to companies that basically make OLED panels. but we also have a lot of expertise in chemical synthesis for these materials and also in chemical simulations. But the company is not just exclusively a software company. We do make software. It is pretty much all for internal consumption preliminarily, like at the start. Sometimes our customers will ask for it. We negotiate with them on that. But our first and foremost is to demonstrate a materials discovery process for industrially relevant and production-ready chemicals, which can only be done when you can actually in-house test, be able to actually competently do in-house testing at a pilot scale. Otherwise, you're just proposing hypothetical materials that, probably won't work in reality.
Yeah, and that's, like I said earlier, that's kind of why I wanted to have you on to get this approach, an analysis of this approach. Like what's it like to use these techniques and then still be putting something out into the world that's not necessarily quantum as the end result, right? Because our goal is to have this permeate all industries one day and impact in some way, shape, or form real use cases. So when you're talking about displays, and then we're going to dig into what you do with actual quantum software, but when you talk about displays, real high level, what kinds of technologies, like where the cameras are and like behind the display glass, that kind of thing? Is that what you work on?
Yeah. So our mainstay product line is the cathode patterning material. It allows the cathode to self-assemble, and in such way you can basically create little, at the micro feature level, little kind of areas where the cathode is not. The cathode is one of the biggest contributors to absorption, like light absorption. So, if you wanted an under display camera to get rid of the notch or to get rid of the punch hole, you still have to contend with that. The cathode on the OLED screen is going to absorb most of the light. And this is even a bigger problem for the infrared sensors. Cathode loves to absorb pretty much 90% of the infrared wavelength. And so if you wanted your Face ID to work with an under panel sensor, it's only ever going to work with the cathode patterning materials, right? Because other cathode options are not, they basically all absorbed in the IR space. So switching alternative cathodes is not really an option. That's predominantly what our mainstay products are. We also dabble a bit in the developing some simulation tools and, exploring kind of esoteric phosphorescent and fluorescent materials. Sometimes they have OLED applications. Sometimes they have like strange medical applications as well. That's predominantly though, like fairly small R&D projects. Like our mainstay product that we ship, it's cathode patterning materials.
Great. So this is a real thing in the world, and everyone hates notches and punch holes. I mean, I know I do. I can't stand it. You're watching something, it's like, oh, look, there's a nice black bar in the middle of it forever. So how does quantum figure in now? Now let's start to zoom in a little bit, and what types of advances and processes you're implementing to actually improve these materials in the real world.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, with a material so sensitive or important with light, the material has to basically be transparent and it has to have a very particular refractive index. And those are two properties that are directly related to the what we call the electronic structure of a chemical, which is basically a fancy word to say, where are the electrons? What energy do they have? What's the energy relative to each electron? This is fundamentally a quantum phenomenon. Electrons behave as if they are wave functions, and they are simulated as such. And this is really where quantum computing starts to kind of become quite relevant. Quantum chemistry is a field that's quite old, since the 1930s. But the inherent challenge with quantum chemistry is that some of these molecules are quite large. And they have they could have like a metal center, or they could have kind of what we would say is like non-carbon elements, second row or third row elements. And so these kind of really start to introduce complexity into these electronic structure calculations. So if you were to just look at, the standard prescription from the conventional standpoint would be like, well, let's just use density functional theory on this. density functional theory is a very powerful tool, but when we start talking about molecules that kind of deviate from, kind of standard practice or standard phenomenon, density functional theory all of a sudden becomes, well, I've switched out, a couple atoms here and a couple atoms there, but now I need to change my DFT functional. So all the kind of computational guiding principles that you've gotten from using, training or developing models that use one DFT functional, now basically, since you've had to switch, those models have to be kind of thrown out. They're no longer really reliable. And that's one of the caveats with density functional theory, is that it's because of this problem where you have to select the DFT functional, it's not reliable. So you find study after paper where research groups will basically post their most favorite density functional, and they will go and cherry pick examples that their density functional is super good at. And all of a sudden now it becomes, well, from the industrial supply, it's like, well, I can't just cherry pick my examples, right? So I need a true ab initio method. Well, with true ab initio methods, the only one which effectively kind of works is something called DLMPO, couple cluster singles doubles. This is just a fancy word for a post-Hartree-Fock ab initio method. Well, in our case, it doesn't really work because the core assumptions that allow couple cluster theories to work don't really apply in our case. And it just ends up being that you end up with somewhat unreliable. Again, you end up with more reliable results. So the question is, can we use a quantum computer, because hypothetically it should be better at solving these quantum chemistry problems in a more, maybe at better scale or in more accurately? Can we basically use these? Can we use this quantum computer and the theory that underpins quantum chemistry on a quantum computer to basically do more accurate calculations?
Okay. And the computer you chose, if we're talking about optimizing the placement here, it seems to sound like you're talking annealing, right?
So actually we use an in-house simulator because it gives us scale. Right. Quantum chemistry can translate onto an annealer. And so we've done a lot of research around that. It's just that the main reason why the annealer is quite powerful initially is that when you look at the standard methods for doing quantum chemistry on a quantum computer, you have to I know we're getting to the nitty gritty. So if there's any questions, just, don't feel free to ask. But you have quantum phase estimation and variational quantum eigensolver. These are the kind of the two core algorithms. So now you can get into machine learning, but machine learning has its own problems, right? Where you now have to get basically reams and reams of data, which you don't have. And then you're just going to dump statistical noise onto a model that already has bias. So now we're kind of back at square one with DFT. And if you're back at square one with DFT, you might as well just use DFT, right? The conundrum is that with quantum phase estimation, the quantum computer must be maintaining coherence on the order of days. And this isn't my research that predicts this. This is research that comes out of Microsoft. It comes out of many of the quantum computing companies. You can look at some of their publications in high-profile journals where they're basically saying that, you need to maintain coherence on the order of kind of hours and days. And really, that's not something where an actual quantum computer has actually done.
No.
With variational quantum eigensolver, you have this sampling problem. We have to keep repeating the measurement process on a circuit to basically measure the individual components of the Hamiltonian. And so while this is a variational process, which is good, it's what we like because variational processes have a bias we understand and can account for. The inherent problem is that what people don't like to mention is that as the qubit size increases, the number of samples you have to do increases exponentially. So all of a sudden, it's like, well, yes, we've run systems like water and hydrogen. We were one of the first groups to do an 8-qubit, technically larger than what IBM simulated on their quantum computer. Basically, I think about a year afterwards, we were able to use Righetti's quantum computer with minimal actually interference or adjustments, and we were able to simulate water using it. An 8-qubit water, so bigger than their beryllium simulation. is still tiny in retrospect. And it has already been surpassed, by Google doing a 20 qubit chain of hydrogen simulation. But in terms of the, with VQE, it's just kind of like, well, the runtime just increases dramatically. But one of the things that the D-Wave is very good at is the D-Wave can basically do that variational sampling almost instantaneously with no overhead, with minimal overhead. And so you can basically get an exact answer if you can translate it into the Ising problem. And we can translate our problem into the Ising thing. It's just that, eventually we figured out how to mimic this on a classical computer so that we can just directly compute expectation values without actually having to really sample. But it's really only applicable to our system of quantum chemistry because the way that the qubit couple, our kind of patented theory that we developed, the qubit couple cluster theory, which is kind of has spawned its own branch of quantum chemistry theory, because the gate sets have a certain form, they're quite easily simulatable on a classical computer. They have, peculiarities of how we can decompose them, how we can kind of represent them in classical memory that allows us to basically, directly calculate variational expectation values without having to actually truly sample anything. And that's kind of one of the core advantages that we've kind of just developed over the course of the 6 years.
So normally when you benchmark annealing, you do like, let's say digital annealers, you do simulation on a classical machine, and then usually D-Wave as the standard for the annealer. And then sometimes you toss in their hybrid, although with their hybrid solver, we don't really know what percentage is quantum. So did you look at some of the other choices too before settling on classical emulation, or did you try like digital annealing to see what kind of performance you get out of that?
Oh yeah, we've tried everything, right? It's just at the end of the day, like when you have your own in-house simulator, you save a lot of money, right? So it's like, what's obviously I'm accountable to, our company, even financially, and to our investors. And at the end of the day, it's like, well, I'm getting the same number from our simulator versus what the digital annealer or D-Wave can produce. And that's the only thing. I know people like to beat up on these annealers and saying, well, classical computers can do it, but fundamentally they do produce an answer, and they can produce it in some cases actually faster than what we can do. It's just that on a cost basis, there's not really much competition at that point. We have ours completely on demand whenever we want it. There's no queue. Yeah. We don't sit in a queue. We pay fractions of pennies to get an answer. And so it's just at that point, it's like, well, it's just economically, it makes sense for us to keep it in-house.
Yeah, the 24/7 thing, that kills a lot of use cases, right? Like fraud detection, for example. They're like, well, we don't want to wait online or run it once a week. We want to actually have this thing going. So can you tell us a little bit about your simulated annealer? It'd be interesting to hear how it works.
It's not technically a simulated annealer, right? It's technically a kind of quantum emulator. It's that, we basically have it all geared to do quantum chemistry on a quantum computer. So it uses the same mathematical principles that a quantum computer would use, right? It's just that, through our methods that we've developed, and, we've published academic papers about these methods, like through binary encoding, et cetera. We can basically, traditionally the argument about using quantum computers is that with a quantum computer, the amount of RAM or memory to simulate scales exponentially, 2 to the power of n. Yep. So through kind of our encoding methods, we've been able to bring that down to, n to the power 4, which is much better than 2 to the power of n. And so that allows us to, simulate, we are doing simulations up to like 250 qubits on now these things do have a lot of RAM. They are quite big machines. Let's not lie about that, this is happening on a desktop. You can simulate things like, probably about 70, 80, 90 qubits on a simple laptop. When you start reaching 250 qubits, you need things that have at least about 1 terabyte of RAM, just to make sure the simulation goes to completion. But, we are now, our kind of development path has now kind of taken the turn where we don't really necessarily see us at least in the, 2 to 5 year term that we're necessarily competing against quantum computers doing quantum chemistry. We're actually now starting to compete against the conventional methods like coupled cluster singles doubles, DMRG, DMET. That's really where we see our true competition, is these very advanced methods. And in our case, we do have a method that is quantum inspired, so it has all the advantages of running on technically a quantum computer. We can run it classically. There's a small cost to that in terms of relative to what a theoretical perfect quantum computer would ever be able to do. But we now see this as, testing against, very well-established quantum chemistry benchmarks. And, we're able to outperform things like DMRG when it comes to that. Our method isn't all well-rounded method. It deals with, DMRG in particular, even though, researchers have posted that, in theory, a quantum phase estimation for a sparse Hamiltonian would never technically outperform DMRG. The theory works out, the analysis is correct. The conundrum that you would have to then throw back is that, well, is every molecule a sparse Hamiltonian? The answer is no. If you ever deal with real molecules like the OLED molecules that we deal with, that then we translate into Hamiltonians, they are not sparse at all. They're quite complex, because once you start getting into trying to actually have a quantitative value opposed to a qualitative value, right? DMRG, or you have a molecule that's not a perfect chain, a linear chain of atoms, you need a well-rounded, high-quality method that doesn't have implicit assumptions in it, right? And that is where, our qubit coupled cluster combined with our simulator handles things very well. It basically treats, it's able to, basically plow through any type of system.
So when you're thinking about scaling this in the future for other projects, how do you decide how much to invest in this going forward, as to like when you predict some kind of tipping point where it should be quantum hardware? Like, do you have a plan, like next year you're going to double its horsepower or something in anticipation of a still gap before the time when quantum is actually ready to step in?
It's a good question. We keep planning to, the code is basically runs on parallel, is highly parallelized. The kind of the roadmap is like, well, can we get this onto GPUs? We do need very specialty GPUs to actually get this to run, because you need you need very high latency between, or very low latency between low latency. You have very high data transfer, but low latency between the GPU itself and the RAM, because GPUs don't have enough RAM. We're still talking about needing hundreds of gigabytes of RAM, and there's not too many GPUs out there that actually have like a terabyte of RAM, but they're connected to RAM and they can have low latency in terms of accessing that RAM. That is really, where we're kind of going to. So hopefully we can get not just like, just a 2x speed up, but we could perhaps get like a 5 or 10x speed up in our computations, from what we published back in 2021 to where we are today in, 2023, we have now about a 10x speed up overall in terms of our computations back from our regular benchmarking systems. When a quantum computer will be available, I'm not as certain anymore about when a good quantum computer will come out. I don't think that quantum computers doing variational quantum eigensolver themselves will be competitive. I still think that quantum phase estimation does pose the, it's the hypothetically the best alternative to what we're doing, right? Mm-hmm. There's definitely, to say that, quantum phase estimation is still, when quantum computers get better, people will be able to explore more what quantum phase estimation can actually deliver. So quantum phase estimation still has a lot of potential in terms of, kind of advancing the state of the art, unless, what the other thing we invest in is trying to develop completely alternative methods, doing quantum chemistry on a quantum computer, post phase estimation or variation of quantum eigensolver. But in order to get to that, where people think quantum phase estimation will actually start working for quantum chemistry, the current best estimates are like you need 2,844 logical qubits that are all fully connected. And you need, gate operators that are on the scale of nanoseconds, like 10 nanoseconds, 5, 10 nanoseconds. And you need effectively true fault tolerance, like not just error correction. Like this thing can't just have its errors corrected. It needs to be perfect, near perfect. And it's just because the way that, the Hamiltonians that you generate for quantum chemistry, the way they're encoded onto a phase estimation algorithm, it's that, unless your qubitization or Trotter step is basically going to infinity, you're going to have some error. So you've already taken a trade-off. And that's okay. You can quantify that trade-off. But these circuits are not small. These circuits are incredibly long. And so there's just the question is, it's cool that we're seeing quantum computers with 400 qubits. But for quantum chemistry, it's not enough. Especially since variational quantum eigensolver will not really get us to the end, right? You can't, variational quantum eigensolver, it's like you really need quantum phase estimation or something completely new. So until we see something convincing that's completely new via quantum phase estimation is kind of going to be the best kind of hypothetical roadmap. And at this point, Google up even is, in 2029, Google says, then we'll finally have a quantum computer that will have good fault tolerance and error correction. So maybe 2029 is when we would expect something. But there's a lot of years between that. There's another 6 years between now and 2029. So, I'm not just going to sit around and wait for that.
Yeah, obviously. And you're making a couple of points I like to make lately when I talk to people about this. It's quantum inspired right now is the way. I mean, if you want to do actual ROI right now, it's definitely the way. And it's exciting when you can apply it to a real world product like you guys did, which is terrific. There are competitors coming out now for NVIDIA, right? Basically, they're starting to play in that space of alternate paradigms of doing more kind of on-chip close to the GPU. So it might be that your next design does sort of take into account one of these alternative pieces of hardware. Not that I'm exactly sure what's in it right now, but yeah. So you'll be benchmarking and deciding, I guess, as you go along. Is this platform then easily adaptable to a future project that you want to do? If you have anything like on a roadmap, are you coming out with other types of products that are going to take advantage of these quantum inspired approaches?
Yeah, well, we're working on, currently a couple, we had received a government grant to explore whether this could be used to design like fuel cell catalysts.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Non-platinum fuel cell catalysts. And so, these are fairly tricky systems because they have metal centers, which don't, DFT does an okay job of them. But again, it because they have large swings in what atoms are binding to each other, DFT functionals have to constantly be substituted out. And so, this is an area where we're kind of actively exploring whether because IQCC is more neutral in how it treats chemistry, like chemical systems, we're kind of looking at that in terms of whether it could be used to design these, potentially design a new fuel cell or a cheaper fuel cell catalyst.
Oh, that's really, really cool. So yeah, I wanted listeners to realize that, next time they look at a phone or a tablet and it doesn't have a hole or a notch, and one day, potentially a different fuel cell, that it could have been quantum inspired that got them there. That's definitely worth noting that this stuff is real right now, especially while we're waiting for the machines to reach fault tolerance. Were there any other last things you wanted to leave our listeners with about the company or your plans?
Well, I just mean it's to talk about that or to emphasize that quantum inspired. Really, the quantum inspired is it's a very useful exercise. And even though we're not actually using a real quantum computer to do our computations, just by going through the exercise of trying to push the scientific boundaries, we've actually learned a lot about conventional quantum chemistry, stuff that we probably wouldn't have learned unless we actually did these exercises. About in quantum chemistry, there's bunch of internal parameters that you can basically select to build your chemical system, like things like basis set selection. We've learned more about how basis sets are influenced by correlation methods, which is fancy lingo to say electrons basically kind of interacting with each other directly. How do basis sets profoundly affect that, more so than you would probably learn in a course or even just by doing density functional theory. It's a really important it's a really important journey and process. But I would also I'd also like to make the additional emphasis that, like, in order to conduct what we've done, where we can use a quantum inspired method to develop new materials, you have to be very good at materials discovery. Some people, they'll always ask me, well, when will a quantum computer ever help actually design a material? And I say, well, it's either going to be now, which is today, or actually probably about a year ago, or it's going to be infinite out into the future. I guess maybe, depending whether humans become a spacefaring civilization or not, that could be their end, a couple billion years from now, or it could end, maybe even much further than that. But fundamentally, if you can't design a material normally with computational tools, a quantum computer is not going to bail you out magically. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's a really important emphasis. A thing that I like to emphasize is that, to be very good and disciplined at materials discovery, it's one of the core aspects that OTI has, is because, we're not we are a for-profit company. We're not subsidized by the Canadian government to the extent that some other chemical companies are, where basically they can just take 1,000 chemists and throw them at a problem. And that's actually a lot of chemical design from some of the biggest chemical companies in the world is still, they just take 1,000 chemists and they just throw them at the problem. It's basically, you just cross your fingers that one of them works, right? They go and synthesize 100,000 compounds and they cross their fingers that one of them works. Whereas, like, that company could be using conventional computers today to design compounds, but most of the cases they don't. And it's because there's a lot of corporate and structural problems and a lack of understanding of what materials discovery really is, right? A lot of people think that, the quantum computer is going to bail them out of doing actual materials discovery, or, even the best one is, AI is going to bail me out of actually thinking about how to do materials discovery. And it's like, it's like what the CEO of Schrodinger said, is he said, machine learning and AI is old news in materials discovery. It's already robotics, AI, machine learning. It's old in our field. It's really surprisingly old. 8 years ago, I was setting up robotics to do stem cell, technically materials discovery for stem cells. Roche sells a wonderful and very vibrant array of all these wonderful robotics that will basically do effectively materials discovery for you. It's old hat. So a lot of people who are, banking on materials discovery startups, you have to really ask I think that to listeners, if you're going to if you're thinking about materials discovery or into the field, it's a vibrant field because it's constantly changing. But at the end of the day, the only true demonstration of materials discovery is getting something into a customer's hands, right?
Yeah.
Having an algorithm that just coughs up little doodles on a piece of paper is not materials discovery, right? It's just doodles. And I think that it's important to emphasize that, for us, the quantum computer has been so helpful at understanding that materials discovery process and understanding what those simulations do and what that means, so that we can get a chemical actually into someone's hands. Right?
And when we have a fault-tolerant quantum computer, all your learnings along this journey are completely transferable.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're already there at the cutting edge with that. So, yeah, that's terrific. I really enjoyed this chat. I wanted our listeners to hear what your customers are getting out of this, and how this is really turning into real world products. So, these techniques are real. So, yeah, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me on.
Now it's time for Coherence, the Quantum Executive Summary, where I take a moment to highlight some of the business impacts we discussed today, in case things got too nerdy at times. Let's recap. OTI Lumionics develops advanced materials with a focus on different display technology. But it's how they're doing it that's of interest here. They use quantum and quantum-inspired techniques to make their materials a reality today. The company's main product is cathode patterning material, or CPM, which enables cathodes to self-assemble. At the micro level, this method allows for the creation of tiny areas where the cathode is not present. As a result, light of different wavelengths can pass through from the outside in, enabling not only under-display cameras, but ones that support IR needed for face unlock features of phones. Achieving this type of material is a tricky process, a blend of achieving transparency in spots and maintaining a particular refractive index. These properties are related directly to the electronic structure of the chemical. Quantum chemistry is used to solve for the location of electrons and their energy, and also the energy relative to each electron. The system doing that difficult math is a quantum emulator put together in-house at OTI Lumionics. The company is also working on potential new, hopefully cheaper, fuel cell catalysts. As I've said before, quantum-inspired algorithms and hardware are having a big impact today and providing real ROI while we wait for fault-tolerant quantum computing. That does it for this episode. Thanks to Scott Genin for joining to discuss OTI Lumionics. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to Protiviti's The Post-Quantum World and maybe leave a review to help others find us. Be sure to follow me on all socials at Constant Hacker. That's Constant with a K, Hacker. You'll find links there to what we're doing in quantum computing services at Protiviti. You can also DM me questions or suggestions for what you'd like to hear on the show. For more information on our quantum services, check out Protiviti.com or follow Protiviti Tech on Twitter and LinkedIn. Until next time, be kind and stay quantum curious.